Projects don't exist in bubbles or in isolation, unaffected by the rest of the world. Like everything else, they're subject to external influences. One way of beginning to consider our project holistically in this way is by thinking about our stakeholders. Now, a stakeholder is often defined traditionally as an individual with an interest in our project because they're either directly involved in the work or can be affected by its outcome. But to me, they're more than that. Yes, of course, it's people who are involved or can benefit, but also any person, group, individual, team, supplier, collaborator who is working on my project, who's active in my project, who's involved in my project, who can influence my project, either positively or negatively, who can be affected by my work, either positively or negatively, who can benefit from my work, either positively or negatively. Basically, anyone, no matter how tenuous the link, who can touch or be touched by my work is a potential stakeholder, with our positive stakeholders sometimes called advantageous and negative ones called adverse. There are many, many good reasons why you should consider identifying stakeholders early in a project. For instance, if you read any project management textbook or blog, it will talk about the importance of stakeholder management and how its primary input is into communications planning. And of course, that's very important. Who do we need to speak to? Who needs to speak to each other? How are we going to communicate and so on? But it's a lot more than that. First, if we're thinking about stakeholders being positive or adverse, then we're starting to consider risks, threats, or potential opportunities, people or groups we need to be aware of and maybe need to mitigate, or some out there who could actually help us. And we try to identify as many as possible. Stakeholders you forget about will almost always become adverse, simply because you've forgotten about them. But secondly, if we're thinking about individual stakeholders, we can also think about their wants and needs and desires, and this begins to inform the scope of my project. I don't truly know what I should be doing until I've considered all of the different parties involved. Finally, if I'm thinking about how my stakeholders influence my project scope, and potentially how my stakeholders are affected by the outcomes, then I'm beginning to consider the impact my project is making. And particularly in research at the moment, impact is the biggest buzzword going, and the most important thing that we need to demonstrate to funders. For stakeholder identification, I typically use a mind map and just begin jotting down as many stakeholders as possible. There's only one rule when doing this. If you think of it, write it down. You can always cross these out later if you don't think they're really that relevant. Just by way of an example, a PhD is a project that people think of as being fairly isolated in terms of stakeholders. It's pretty much just me and my supervisor. But when you start thinking about all the different elements that you need to consider, very quickly it becomes very complicated. The last thing to say here is that the stakeholder diagram will change and grow organically over the lifetime of the project. You'll discover new stakeholders as you find out more about your project, and other stakeholders will take on a reduced role over time. So it's something you want to keep your eye on. So in summary, stakeholder identification helps us to understand communication requirements in a project, who I should be talking to and when, allows us to unearth risks earlier, and then deal with them before they become too serious, and lets us think about the wants and needs and desires of individuals, which in turn can give us our expectations. But finally, it allows us to consider the effects that the outputs of our work are having on others, and in doing so, we can begin to articulate the impact of our project.